September 2, 1944. The forward headquarters of the Third Army, somewhere east of the Meuse River, France. General George S. Patton picked up the telephone and listened. On the other end of the line, Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, delivered the order that every German commander from the Rhine to Berlin had been praying for since August 1st. The Third Army would halt. Fuel allocations were being redirected. The advance east would stop. Patton set the telephone down. He turned to his Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, and said something that Gay recorded in his personal diary that evening. The words were not fit for a press release. They were not fit for most dinner tables. But their meaning was precise, unambiguous, and strategically correct in a way that military historians are still arguing about 80 years later. Patton believed, and told anyone who would listen, and many who would not, that stopping the Third Army at the German border in September 1944 was not a pause. It was a decision. And that decision, he argued with a fury that his staff found simultaneously exhausting and compelling, would cost more lives than it saved, extend the war by months, and hand the Germans a gift they had not earned and did not deserve. He was right. The Germans knew it first. To understand what Patton said and why it mattered, you have to understand what the German army looked like on September 1, 1944, from the inside. Not from Allied intelligence summaries, which were optimistic. Not from newspaper reports, which were triumphalist. From the perspective of the men trying to hold the line against the most dangerous armored force in the Western theater. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff for Ob West. Oberbefehlshaber West, the German Supreme Command in the Western Theater, sent a situation assessment to Army Group B on August 31, 1944, that has since become one of the most cited documents in the historiography of the Western Front's final year. Blumentritt wrote that the German forces west of the Rhine were, as of that date, incapable of organized resistance along a continuous front. Not weakened. Not depleted. Incapable. He estimated the German divisions in the path of the Third Army's advance had an average effective combat strength of approximately 3,000 men against a paper establishment of 15,000. 20%. The panzer divisions that had bled the Americans at Morton and in the Falaise killing ground were reporting fewer than 20 operational tanks each, against an authorized strength of 160. General Feldmarschall Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, reviewed Blumentritt's assessment and sent his own memorandum to Berlin on September 3, 1944. Model was not a man given to defeatism. Hitler trusted him precisely because he could stabilize collapsing fronts through sheer force of will and tactical intelligence. His September 3 memo was, by his own standards, as close to desperation as he ever committed to paper. He wrote that without a halt in the Allied advance of a minimum of 6 weeks, the German army in the West could not reconstitute a coherent defensive line along the West Wall, the fortified border zone the Allies called the Siegfried Line, and that without that line, the road to the Rhine and beyond was, operationally speaking, open. 6 weeks. Model needed 6 weeks. What he got was far more. The Allied logistical crisis of September 1944 is well documented in American military history. What is less often examined is how precisely the German command understood it and how deliberately they moved to exploit it. The arithmetic was straightforward and brutal. Allied forces had advanced approximately 500 miles from the Normandy beaches in roughly 90 days. The logistical infrastructure, the fuel depots, ammunition dumps, maintenance facilities, and road networks that sustained armored operations was still anchored near the coast. A Sherman M4 tank consumed approximately 50 gallons of fuel per 100 miles of road movement, more across country. An armored division moving at operational tempo burned 100,000 gallons per day. The Third Army, with 4 corps and 12 divisions, required fuel deliveries measured in millions of gallons per week to sustain its advance. The Red Ball Express, the emergency truck convoy system, established August 25, 1944, was moving 12,500 tons of supplies daily across a 400-mile one-way circuit. It was extraordinary. It was not enough. By September 1, 1944, Patton's Third Army had, in his own recorded words, about 40,000 gallons of gasoline remaining, against a daily operational requirement of approximately 400,000 gallons, 1/10 of minimum operating stock. The tanks of the 4th Armored Division, the sharpest instrument in Patton's arsenal, were sitting on roads east of the Meuse with dry fuel gauges, their crews waiting, their commanders watching the horizon, while the decision about where the available fuel would flow was being made 200 miles away, at SHAEF headquarters. General Dwight Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north for the operation that would become Market Garden was not arbitrary. It reflected a strategic judgment about the war's most likely path to victory and a political reality involving the V weapon launch sites in the Netherlands that were still raining devastation on London. The logic was defensible. Patton never accepted it as such, and he said so with a directness that made his staff wince and his superiors reach for their antacids. "Ike is the best general the British have," Patton wrote in his diary on September 2, 1944. The compliment was not intended kindly. What Patton actually said to Eisenhower, through the telephone, in person at SHAEF meetings, and in the unfiltered medium of his private diary, constitutes one of the most sustained and analytically coherent arguments against a strategic decision made by a superior officer in the documented history of the American military. It deserves examination not for its drama, though the drama is considerable, but for its content. Patton's first argument was operational. He told Eisenhower on September 2nd and again on September 12th at the Versailles Conference that the German forces opposing the Third Army's advance toward the Saar and the Rhine were, in his assessment, incapable of sustained organized resistance if pressed continuously. He was not speaking from optimism. He was citing the evidence his intelligence officer, Brigadier General Oscar Koch, had assembled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and aerial reconnaissance. Koch's assessment, delivered to Patton on September 1st, identified an average German defensive density east of the Third Army's forward positions of fewer than 5,000 men per 20-mile front sector, approximately 1/4 of the minimum density required for organized positional defense. According to German doctrine, Patton's position was this: the German army in the West was not retreating to a prepared defensive line. It was falling. There was a difference between a retreating army and a falling one. A retreating army moves to a new position and reconstitutes. A falling army disperses, loses cohesion, abandons equipment, and requires weeks or months of reorganization before it can fight again. The German army in the West was falling. If the Third Army stopped, even briefly, the Germans would stop falling. They would use the pause to reconstitute. And reconstituting even a fraction of the 60-plus divisions that had been shattered in Normandy in the subsequent pursuit meant turning a falling army into a retreating one, and eventually a fighting one. Eisenhower heard the argument. He understood it. He overruled it. His reasons were not irrational. The broad front strategy, advancing along the entire Allied line rather than concentrating resources for a single deep thrust, reflected a genuine concern about extending one army's supply lines to the point of catastrophic overreach. An army that advances faster than its logistics can follow is not an army on the edge of victory. It is an army on the edge of encirclement. Patton's own Third Army had demonstrated this risk in miniature when it ran dry east of the Meuse. But here is where the German perspective provides the counterintuitive insight that changes everything. Model's 6-week reconstitution estimate was not pessimistic, it was accurate. German Army Group B received the halt it needed, not all at once, not cleanly, but effectively, in the sense that the Allied advance slowed from the breakout velocity of August to the grinding attritional pace of October and November. In 6 weeks, from September 1 to October 15, 1944, German forces reconstituted 14 divisions in the West Wall. They moved anti-tank guns, artillery, and infantry into the prepared positions along the Siegfried Line that Blumentritt had described as the last viable defensive barrier west of the Rhine. They laid mines, they zeroed artillery. They built, in the time the Allied halt gave them, exactly the defensive infrastructure that Model had said they needed to stop the Allied advance cold. And then they did stop it cold. The Hürtgen Forest. The Siegfried Line engagements of October and November 1944. The approaches to Aachen, which fell to the Americans on October 21, 1944, only after 3 weeks of some of the most costly urban combat on the Western Front, street by street, building by building, against defenders who had used Model's 6 weeks productively. American casualties in the Hürtgen Forest campaign between September and December 1944 exceeded 33,000 men. The forest that could have been bypassed in September became a killing ground in November because the Germans had been given the time to make it one. Patton watched all of it from the Third Army sector and said nothing for publication. In his diary, he was less restrained. November 8, 1944. The Third Army launched Operation Madison, the assault across the Moselle River toward the Saar, with what fuel and ammunition Schaeff's allocation had finally permitted. The delay since September had done exactly what Patton predicted. The German First Army, shattered and retreating in September, had used the pause to dig in along the Saar River line with a density and deliberateness that its August condition had made unimaginable. General der Panzertruppe Hermann Bulge, who had assumed command of Army Group G, the formation opposing Patton's Third Army, on September 21, 1944, was one of the most talented defensive commanders the Wehrmacht possessed. His performance on the Eastern Front, holding positions with fractions of the authorized strength while Soviet forces 3 times his size battered against him, had earned him the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the highest military decoration in the German armed forces. Awarded to fewer than 30 men during the entire war, he was not a man who wasted time. From September 21 to November 8, 1944, 48 days, Bulge used every hour of the Allied pause to transform Army Group G from the wreckage that had stumbled east out of France into something that could, and did, resist. He consolidated remnants of 7 broken divisions into 4 reconstituted ones. He positioned artillery along the eastern bank of the Moselle, with overlapping fields of fire calculated to turn river-crossing attempts into disasters. He stockpiled ammunition at forward positions, moving supplies at night when Allied air power was grounded, building reserves that his September condition had made inconceivable. On November 8, when Patton's forces crossed the Moselle, they encountered exactly the army that Patton had told Eisenhower would exist if the pause was granted. Not the helpless, disorganized, fuel-less wreck of September. A reconstituted, entrenched, artillery-heavy defensive force that had used 6 weeks to convert a natural river line into a fortified barrier. The Third Army crossed the Moselle. They always crossed. Patton's forces had a quality of sustained offensive determination that Bulge himself acknowledged in his post-war memoirs, writing that the Americans under Patton displayed an operational persistence that I had previously associated only with Russian forces in their most motivated formations, but crossing cost. The engagements along the Moselle and into the Saar in November and December 1944 cost the Third Army approximately 20,000 casualties, men killed, wounded, and missing in terrain, and against defenses that, in September, had not existed in any organized form. Patton's diary entry for November 9, 1944, the day after the Moselle crossing began, is one of the most controlled pieces of prose he ever committed to paper. No profanity, no theatrical fury, just numbers. The strength of German resistance encountered, the casualties sustained, the ground gained. And at the bottom, a single sentence that his aide Colonel Charles Codman read and did not comment on. This is what I told them it would cost. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, Operation Market Garden, the airborne assault into the Netherlands that had received the fuel and priority denied to Patton, had already failed. September 17 to 25, 1944. The furthest Allied penetration, at Arnhem, collapsed when the German 2 SS Panzer Corps reconstituted formations that Allied intelligence had placed in the area but assessed as combat ineffective destroyed the British 1st Airborne Division. 17,000 Allied airborne troops entered the operation. Fewer than 6,000 returned. The bridge at Arnhem was not taken. The war was not shortened. The Germans had used the pause Eisenhower's broad front strategy provided. They had used it in the Netherlands to destroy an airborne army. They had used it in the Saar to rebuild a ground force. And they had used it in the Ardennes, most devastatingly of all, to plan and prepare the counter-offensive that would launch December 16, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge, against an Allied line that had ground itself to exhaustion in 3 months of exactly the attritional fighting that Patton had argued was unnecessary. He was not told he had been right. He knew anyway. The post-war record validates Patton's September argument with a completeness that is almost uncomfortable to examine directly. The statistical case begins with a comparison between what the German army was in September 1944 and what it had become by December. In September, German forces west of the Rhine were fielding an average armored strength of fewer than 250 operational tanks across the entire Western Front, against a theoretical establishment of more than 3,000. By December 16, 1944, the date of the Ardennes offensive, German armored strength in the West had recovered to approximately 970 operational tanks, concentrated in the assault force. This was not a miracle. It was 6 weeks of manufacturing output, repair operations, and redeployment from the Eastern Front that the pause had made possible. Without the pause, those tanks arrive at depots to find a front that has already collapsed. General der Infanterie Siegfried Westphal, Chief of Staff at OB West from September 1944, provided the most direct post-war validation in his 1951 memoir. He wrote that in the first week of September 1944, OB West had no coherent reserve capable of opposing a determined Allied thrust across the West Wall with less than 4 weeks' notice. 4 weeks. The Allied halt lasted 8. Westphal's assessment makes explicit what the numbers imply. The German army in the West was given twice the time it needed to recover, and it used every day of the surplus. The human cost of that surplus is measurable. American casualties in the Hürtgen Forest, 33,000. American casualties in the Moselle and Saar campaigns, November through January, approximately 50,000. American casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, 75,000 killed, wounded, and captured. These 3 campaigns, all fought against German forces that had reconstituted during the September halt, cost the United States Army approximately 158,000 casualties in 4 months. Against an enemy that Blumentrit's own September 1st assessment described as incapable of organized resistance. Oscar Koch, Patton's intelligence chief, published his own assessment in 1971. He wrote that the Third Army's intelligence picture in September 1944 had been the clearest operational opportunity I observed in the entire European campaign, and that the decision to halt was the most consequential single logistical judgment of the Western Front, measured by its outcome in blood. Koch was not a polemicist. He was a professional intelligence officer reviewing his own record with the precision his training demanded. The German commanders agreed. Bulge, in post-war testimony to the U.S. Army Historical Section, stated plainly that a continued Allied advance in September 1944 would have ended organized resistance west of the Rhine before October 1st. Before October 1st. The war in Europe ended May 8, 1945. 8 months later. The counterintuitive truth at the center of this story inverts the conventional understanding of caution as the conservative choice in warfare. Eisenhower halted Patton because continuing seemed risky. Supply lines were stretched. One army advancing deep into Germany without flank security was, on paper, exposed to catastrophic counterattack. The prudent course was to consolidate, to bring the entire Allied line forward, to ensure no single force outran its support. This is what military doctrine recommends. This is what Schaeff decided. And this prudent, doctrine-compliant, professionally defensible decision cost more lives than the reckless alternative would have. The reckless alternative, pressing a broken enemy before it could reconstitute. accepting logistical risk in exchange for operational momentum, trusting that a falling army cannot be caught twice, was what Patton argued for in September 1944. He argued for it loudly, profanely, persistently, and correctly. He was overruled by a superior officer operating within the legitimate authority of his command. That is how military hierarchy works. Patton accepted the decision and executed his orders with the same relentless professionalism he always brought to whatever mission Schaeff assigned him. But he never stopped believing he was right. And 80 years later, the documents of both sides confirm that he was. Emphasis on this. The most dangerous moment in any pursuit is not the first mile. It is the pause. Because a broken enemy given time to breathe is no longer a broken enemy. Every institution, every organization, every competitor that has ever let a defeated rival recover during a moment of misplaced caution has learned this lesson in its own way and at its own cost. Patton learned it watching the Siegfried Line fill up with Germans who should not have been there. Model learned the inverse. That time, given freely, is the most powerful weapon a desperate defender possesses. The war ended May 8, 1945. 8 months after the German army was, by German testimony, incapable of stopping it. That gap, between what was possible in September 1944 and what actually happened in May 1945, is the space that caution built. And somewhere in that space, measured in the precise arithmetic of 158,000 additional casualties, is the cost of stopping a man who was already at the door.